Pure data, again, is meaningless for humans. Machines, of course, are pretty good at it. But for humans, we need someone to actually translate that data into something that we can understand.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into Notes of Design. To help support our mission spread knowledge, we have a very special guest on today's episode. It was a great honor to host Manuel Lima, who is a fellow of Royal Society of Arts and also named as one of the 50 most creative and influential minds by Creativity magazine. Manuel Lima is a founder of visualcomplexity.com and also presently working as senior UX manager at Google. And he's also a regular teacher of data visualization at Parsons School of Design. He has over 15 years of experience and has worked with companies like Google, Codecademy, Microsoft, Nokia, RGA, and Museum of Moving Pictures. Manuel is a leading voice of information visualization and has spoken at over 80 plus conferences including TED, LIFT, Visualize, Ars Electronica, Harvard, MIT, Yale, and many more. He's been also featured in various magazines like New York Times, Science, Nature, Business Week, Creative Reviews, Forbes, and Seed magazine, and many more. On this episode, we had a great conversation on what exactly is data visualization and why do we need to visualize data. Later that, we discuss on various techniques and process one must follow to represent data visually. Manuel had shared his insights and similarities between UX and data viz. He also gave us some ethical practices that one must follow while handling data. Said with that, hope you guys enjoy this episode, and I have a good news to share with you guys. So Notes of Design became the second most trending podcast in India, and we've been trending charts in many more countries. So thanks to all the wonderful guests who have came and made this mission to spread knowledge possible. So don't forget to tune in into Notes of Design every Friday to get some great knowledge on various design topics from the design leaders across the world. Happy designing, everyone. Hi Manuel, welcome to Notes of Design. It's a pleasure hosting you today on our show.
Pleasure is all mine.
So Manuel, how's your day going?
It's going well, yes. The weather has been getting better here in New York, even though there's a lot of craziness going around. I think it's good. At least the weather is getting better, so one positive thing.
If you could give a brief about yourself to our audience out there.
Sure. My name is Manuel Lima. I've been involved in the design and data visualization community for more than 15 years now. I kind of got started. I'm trained as an industrial designer, building physical products, right, like chairs and tables and all of that kind of objects. But then I really fall in love into data visualization at some point. And that's become kind of a focus of mine for the past 15 years or so. I've also been very involved in the UX design community. And that's kind of like my 9-to-5 job is at the moment being a UX lead at Google. And I've been there for almost 5 years now.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So what was your journey into design and how did you start? What are your tips to the beginners that you want to give right now?
It's a great question. You never quite know how things start, really. I mean, it goes so far back in time that I don't really recall exactly. There was not one single day that I woke up and said, I want to become a designer. But I knew that I think I went from wanting to be a firefighter to wanting to be an architect. And so this was probably very early on in my life. I think maybe I was like maybe 6 or 8. I don't know exactly how old I was. But I think part of my family has always been involved in arts and culture, architecture, poetry. There was a lot of writing historically in my family. So I was definitely more inclined towards that type of thing, especially through my mom. There was a lot of like curious nature. She was a very curious person by default. So I learned early on to be inquisitive. And I think that's still a quality that I appreciate in people in generally, but of course in designers. I think you really have to be curious and inquisitive to be a good designer, right? You have to wonder how things are made, how things are constructed, how things operate, right? You have to have that sort of wonder in your head constantly. And I think I had that a little bit in the beginning. I was obsessed with maps. This is again in a time that predates GPS by a few years. So once we traveled, we always use like physical maps, and I was obsessed by the object itself, right? And also the visual language that maps had, right? All the icons that they had, all the sort of the visual metaphors that they employed, which also changed dramatically from sometimes sometimes country to country. So I was really obsessed about maps. And I remember this cabinet of ours we had at home was filled with these maps from all over the world. And for me, it was just a journey of graphic design, but also a journey about all the different places around the world, right? And then I think my dad used to bring me all these funny objects that he discovered in his own business trips, like this knife that turned into a fork that somehow converted into something else that you were not expecting. So for me, I was really early on exposed to these kind of like intriguing design objects. And I think that was also like another catalyst. And then later on, I think maybe I was 16 when I read a book by Bruno Munari called Design as Art. And I was absolutely obsessed by that book. And the book was really enticing because it really described design not as something that you see in a museum, right? But something that you have to create for the masses, right? A great designer is able to create a sign for a butcher's shop. That's kind of one of the lines in the book, right? And I absolutely love this idea of this pluralistic idea, this pragmatic, very operational driven concept of design, which really tied with my idea of design, not again as something beautiful that you cannot even touch at a museum, but something that's practical that people actually use and it helps their lives in a substantial way. I think that's, so then this is like, I was maybe 16, right? I really became obsessed with design. And then when I turned 18, then I applied to an industrial design course, 4-year degree. Actually, it's old school, so it's like actually a 6-year degree, which is probably a little bit of a waste of time, but that's how it was like back in the day. And this was a 6-year degree in Lisbon, Portugal, studying industrial design. I had a blast just learning a lot about materials, engineering, ergonomic. I think it really gave me a lot of the foundation, thinking about design, in a user-centered way. And I think that led inevitably to UX, which is something that I did after my master's degree at Parsons School of Design in New York.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for taking us through your wonderful journey. So what are your tips to the beginners?
I think it goes back to what I was mentioning about being inquisitive. I think, if you are born with it naturally, like that, great for you, right? So I would say foster that type of thinking, foster that type of behavior. I think it's a really critical one to be inquisitive, to be curious about things in general and about things in particular, right? Because for me, a great designer is one that is able to see the big picture of things, right? See the holistic view into a system, into a process, into a service, but also look at the granular details of that and improving at both scales, right? I think that's a key advantage. So being inquisitive for me is a tremendous trait. And of course, we can spend a lot of time debating about all the hard skills that you should have to become a designer, to be a great designer. But for me, as I sort of evolved my career, working in different places, large and small, before Google, I worked at Microsoft, I worked at RGA, advertising agency, Nokia back in the day when Nokia was actually a big player in the mobile world. So I learned a lot from these experiences. But over the years, I came to realize that for you to succeed is not so much about the hard skills, which anyone can learn to a certain degree. It's really about the soft skills, right? I've seen so many amazing designers, tremendously talented, all the hard skills were in place, but then they were missing the soft skills, right? They were missing maybe the curious nature, the ability to persist, like sometimes you're going to have a lot of like doors being closed in your face, right? So the ability to be persistent, to go after what you want, right? To know how to communicate that idea. You might have the best idea ever. If you don't know how to sell it, if you don't know how to persuade others that this is the best idea, it's meaningless, right? You really know how to communicate that. You really know how to sell this because you're always going to be selling it to someone, either your manager, your client, your stakeholder. There's always someone that you need to convince that this is a great idea in order to get funding, to get approval, to get published, to get to actually go to production. So there's always an implicit idea of persuasion as part of the process. So I think it's some of these soft skills that I would love for people to worry more than just the hard skills alone, right? So again, persistence, persuasion, curiosity, adaptability. Adaptability is a critical thing that I try to sort of screen every time I talk to candidates as well, right? Being able to adapt to a new environment, to a new condition, because we live in this ever-changing world and nothing is static. Change is the norm. Right. So you need to know how to adapt to the circumstances. You cannot really become paralyzed every time you face a new challenge that you're not familiar with, right? So there's multiple soft skills like that I think are really important for young designers and for young people that want to pursue a career in design.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for sharing us these great tips. So as you are like the top writer in data viz and you wrote 3 wonderful books out there, let's begin our discussion into data visualization.
Thank you.
So what exactly is data visualization and why do we need to visualize data and what makes data visualization effective?
Right. So I think why do we need data visualization? That's a great question. And I think maybe I will take you back in time first to understand that, we see data visualization maybe as an alternative to writing text, right? Which is something that you have, of course, to learn. And it's a process, right? Like no one is born with the ability to read an alphabet. You have to learn, right? And it takes many years. And if you think about the oldest written alphabet that we know today is the Sumerian cuneiform, which is roughly 6,000 years old. But humans have been communicating way before there was any sort of known written alphabet, right? So the use of images and symbols and visual representations precedes written language by many, many, many thousands of years, right? You can even argue that we are more inclined to actually read and interpret and communicate through images than we are through text. It's a much more recent invention, if you want to call that. So data visualization as a concept, if you want to be really holistic about it, it's not very new, right? We have been visualizing, communicating data or information, again, goes back way before we have used any written text. But it has become, of course, more of a focus lately in the past couple of centuries or so, mostly because the volume of data has been growing tremendously, right? So the need to make sense of that growth of data, this big data, as they call it now, is, of course, more acute now than ever. So why is it important? One of the reasons is that some of the data we deal today is meaningless for humans in the sense that it's really almost impossible for you as a human to read and make sense of that data. A lot of these data points are, again, numerical data points that absolutely make no sense if you were to read them in isolation. So that's one of the challenges, is that data, and sometimes I always run across the data purist, right? There's always a data purist somewhere that says, hey, you should not really visualize this because you are distorting the data and you are ruining it somehow. But of course, the fact is that pure data, again, is meaningless. Like for humans, machines, of course, are pretty good at it. But for humans, we need someone to actually translate that data into something that we can understand. Now, that translation part is normally either through text or through images, right? In a very simplistic way. So the great benefit of data visualization is to convert this data that is hard for humans to understand into something that is meaningful, right? Into something that you can interpret, you can read, and you can think about it. You can deliberate. Makes you think. And it goes back to this idea of converting information into knowledge. That's really my mission. That's the mission of everyone involved in this area, is making that conversion, making that transformation from data, information into knowledge. So that's the role of data visualization. And how we can be effective. Well, the effectiveness comes if that mission, that goal is achieved, right? If you create a data visualization that it's making the subject more complicated than it is, then most people don't really understand what you are actually representing. It's probably not as effective, right? An effective data visualization would be one that takes into account the data, understands the data pretty well, and is able to transform it, right? To translate it into something that humans can make sense of and can reason with it. Then it goes into visual literacy, which is a really interesting aspect, which is you can argue that, and this is maybe something that we could probably need like a separate podcast just for that topic alone. But it's a really interesting topic. I've been sort of debating about this topic for quite some time, in the sense that somehow written language, again, going back to written language, we know that it takes years to master that process, to be able to read text, right? And sometimes, even after 10 years, you don't really do it properly, right? So it's really hard to master that skill. But somehow we assume that interpreting, reading charts and visual metaphors, somehow you don't need any sort of training whatsoever. Anyone can do it. And of course, it's part of the process because the imagery is so embedded in our systems, right? We have been doing this for such a long time that sometimes people don't think that they actually do require any training or any sort of mastery of that skill. When of course, it's a lie. You really need to educate yourself on how to read some of these things because they're not as intuitive as it might seem. And yes, intuitiveness is part of the goal, right? Like you want to create something that people understand it at a really fast pace and doesn't require a huge learning curve. But that also limits the amount of things that you can explore as a visualizer.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for giving us such great insights on data viz. So what are the various ways that one can start their journey into field of data visualization?
I got started by I recall the exact moment in time that I fell in love with data visualization. And it was kind of like I felt this was a calling, right? And I was doing a Master of Fine Arts at Parsons School of Design. This was maybe back in 2004 in New York. And I remember a teacher of mine showing us this diagram. It's called the understanding spectrum. It's also called the knowledge pyramid, where data leads into information, information leads into knowledge, and knowledge ultimately leads into wisdom. And again, even though my background, as you know, was actually industrial design, I was absolutely so compelled to be part of that spectrum, specifically creating a bridge between information and knowledge. So I think if that's something that is inspiring for people, I think that's the first way to go, right? It's like, wow, I really want to be part of this movement, because it is a movement in the sense that our ability to generate data has by far exceeded our ability to make sense of that data. So we need every human brain we can get hold of to be part of this movement, be part of this community, and help us make sense of this growing volume of data. And especially when, with big data, there's biases, there's a lot of issues now with data. And it's too easy if we don't have some control over it, if we don't have some solid understanding of what this data is doing, right? You run into a danger that it becomes fully automated to a point. Again, we don't really know what's going on anymore. And that's definitely part of the things that data visualization can help, is making the invisible visible and trying to make some of these systems that are not as easy to understand, that are fairly complex, fairly intricate, explain them in simple terms, right? In easier ways for us to understand humans. So I think apart from like many of the soft skills that I mentioned before, or for people that want to become a designer, which applies, of course, to anyone venturing into the data visualization world, I think it's also this desire, again, to help out this movement, that you can call it such, in order to make data and convert data into knowledge.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So what are the various techniques you follow to represent data visually?
That's very varied. I mean, there's a plethora of different approaches and tools you can take. Generally speaking, and even for those who are new to it, you can actually create your own data. By the way, data is not this like monster with 7 heads. Like, anyone knows what data is, right? Like if you say, times of the day, for example, are data points, right? You have lunch at 12, you have, dinner at 7 p.m. Like all those things are data points. I mean, one of the great ways for you to actually start getting a sense of data and visualizing is by tracking your own patterns, right? You can actually build your own sort of data points, your own data lists, and try to visualize them in meaningful ways, right? That would be one quick experiment for anyone wanting to venture into this area. So that's one thing. But then, of course, data. When we talk about data, we talk about spreadsheets. Everyone knows what a spreadsheet is, right? You have rows and you have columns, right? And then rows are basically the things that you have. This could be a collection of books. This could be a collection of, stones that you accumulate over time. And then the columns are the qualities of that thing, right? Which again, you can add a lot of things depending on your collection. So let's say that you are gathering a collection of things, let's say books, right? And then, of course, some of the qualities could be the name of the author, the title, ISBN, all those things that define what a book is. And then the list grows as you add more entries, right? As you add more rows. So in essence, that spreadsheet that you are filling, it's what is called a data set. Now, it's not the only type of data set. There's like relational data sets and other things that are, networks and trees and all that, the different varieties of data that exist out there. But generally speaking, a spreadsheet, for the most part, for I would say the vast majority of cases, is what we call a data set, right? So the next step for you to like collecting a data set, either on your own or get it for someone else, then there's a lot of aspect of parsing and cleaning the data, right? Sometimes you are lacking some fields. There's inconsistencies in the treatment of those fields. So you need to spend a lot of time just sort of cleaning the data, parsing it, making sense that everything is in order, right? Then a lot of after that is probably the next stage is really about, and that's the interesting one, to understanding what kind of goal do you want. What is your ultimate goal? Like you have this data set. What is the ultimate message that you want to convey, right? or what is the sort of the story that's underlying in this specific data set. And I think there's a lot of trial and error. That's a very sort of cyclical process there, which is trying to translate this data into meaningful visual patterns, right, that people can understand. And then it's about selecting the most meaningful, the best sort of visual model for the data set that you have at your disposal. So I think those are the various stages. And then, of course, you can add the stages of like making that chart or diagram that you're creating either interactive, you can actually have filter, you can have different sort of ideas of what you want.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So now, What are the various ways in which the database and UX bridge together? What are the ethical practices that one must look forward to?
Oh, that's a great question. I like that. Ethical practices. I think there's a few things to consider, right, when it comes to ethics. And yeah, I mean, by the way, I love, some people think, well, of course, even myself, I treat these as two separate entities, being UX and data visualization as two separate entities. But I think there's a huge amount of overlap between them, right, by far. And one of the overlaps that I have noticed over the years is all about principles. So I'm a little bit obsessed about design principles, right? These are level guidelines that can help you achieving a given process. And if you look at some of the critical UX design principles, right, they're actually very much aligned with data visualization principles. There's a huge overlap. And ethics comes at the same time, right? I think it goes back to the stages we were talking about. In my view, it comes in three separate stages when it comes to the ethical responsibility of a person doing data visualization. The first one is data collection, making sure that the data source is reliable and verifiable. Right? If you're using data, use it from an institution that, or a source that is actually trustworthy. And whenever possible, you should give attribution to that data, right? Where it was collected, who is providing it, right? So attribution is really important. It also creates, you legitimize the process in its own if you are transparent about it. Then the second point I would say is data analysis. And this is actually something that happens normally behind the scenes. And a lot of people don't really know what happens with the data because, again, sometimes you remove things, you add things, right? There's a lot of opportunity for biases to cripple in, specifically in this process of data analysis. So it's really important that you are clear and transparent with the audience about how did you treat the data, right? First of all, you have, of course, identified where this data came from. And then it's like, how did you treat this data, right? Did you remove things? Did you add things? If so, what for? And then finally, the third stage that you need to be really ethical about is visual encoding, right? So do not use visual metaphors to intentionally hide or confuse the user, right? We know that there's a lot of opportunities for you to again, be biased in the ways you can actually communicate information through visual metaphors. So I think that's another part of your ethical responsibility is be honest, right? About the data that you are doing. And don't confuse the truth. Don't lie, don't mislead users. That's one of the things you should never do. It's part of your moral and ethical responsibility.
Yes, Manuel. Thank you so much. So on a concluding note, we would love to recommend you 3 books and 3 people who inspire you the most in this domain.
Yeah. So 3 books. That's one of the hardest things to actually pick books. I can give you 3 that were kind of pivotal in my life. So as I mentioned, Design as Art by Bruno Munari was a critical book. I read it for the first time when I was maybe 16. I think it was really one of those books, those moments where I read it and it really changed kind of my life, the way that I was looking at it. Design as Art by Bruno Munari. The other one that I would mention, The Atlas of Cyberspace. This is a very unknown book. This was up in the 90s, I think it was published, but it was a huge reference. So this was I think the first maybe book that was trying to map and visualize the different growth areas of the internet. So the Atlas of Cyberspace. It was just a fantastic journey. They had a website as well. And I remember browsing through it and I was obsessed with it, right? And then it was really the catalyst for me to put together visualcomplexity.com, an old website that tries to gather many different examples of people visualizing networks of all types. that was a huge influence for me. So I have to name that book, The Atlas of Cyberspace. And then the third one is Universal Principles of Design. I like to say that as a designer, if my apartment was caught on fire and I had to save one book, I think this would be it, because I love the book. It gives you, like, now I think the latest version, 125 different universal design principles that you can apply to UX, graphic design, industrial design, architecture, every field. I mean, it's a fantastic journey into cognitive science, into behavioral economics, into a variety of different, really understanding the human brain, really understanding the amount of biases that all of us have inside of our own brains. No, I think that's it. I mean, I think the authors are kind of like associated with it. Bruno Munari was definitely a key influence. I think Christopher Alexander, who did the pattern language, was also another critical influence in my life. I remember reading Stephen Johnson as well, the book Emergence. That was a huge inspiration for me. Barabasi, who runs the complexity lab in a Northeastern university, has also been like a huge influence for me. There's so many people. It's hard to pinpoint all the names. Ben Schneiderman has been a huge influence in my life. There's been a lot of people. Of course, some are still with us. Others are not, unfortunately, with us anymore. So the list is almost endless.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for your time. And it's a great honor to host you today on our show. And thanks for joining the Mission Spread Knowledge.
It was my pleasure, my absolute pleasure. And thanks for the invite again. You know, man.